The following presentation on levels of worldview is going to deal with some key worldview concepts and a series of scripture references dealing with a Christian worldview. In the series of the next 4 slides, you will see how worldview, beliefs, values, and behaviors work together to form the understanding of reality and the way that a culture works, regardless of whether it is a Christian culture, a non-Christian culture, a spiritual culture, or a purely secular one. The foundational perspective of an individual or an organization or culture is worldview, answering the question, what is real and what is not. From the hub of this wheel come the beliefs, values, and behaviors that guide and define a culture. Building upon the group's sense of reality, what their worldview is, comes their belief system, answering the question what is true and what is false. So, for example, from a purely secular perspective, what is real would be answered by that which is measurable, observable, repeatable, that which is taken in by the senses, and so anything that is non-material would be considered not real. So the idea of the supernatural is therefore not real. They do not believe that the supernatural exists, and therefore it cannot be true. On the other side of that, Christians believe that both the supernatural and the natural realms exist, and so the idea of the supernatural God of the universe, who is the author and creator of the material realm, has every right and privilege to intersect into natural affairs, and therefore we would call that a miracle. When the supernatural God intervenes in the natural realm, we call that a miracle. Our third level in building a fully orbed worldview understanding is the level of values. Remember, the first level, the most basic and most fundamental level, is the worldview itself, which answers the question, what is real? Second is the belief system, answering the question, what is true and what is false? The value system of a culture or an individual or a family, the value system based on beliefs and worldview, answers the question, what is good or what is evil? And this, in turn, will affect their code of ethics, their behavior system, which we talk about next. As I just mentioned, the fourth and final concentric circle in this diagram is the outermost, that which is most easily observable by other cultures and other worldviews, and that is behavior. What is acceptable and what is unacceptable action? What are the do's and what are the taboos of this group? So as we see these various levels of worldview, what is real, what is true, what is good, what is acceptable, when we look at these 4 levels of worldview, we have a better understanding of the culture, of the family, and we begin to look at these, find ways to build bridges to them in order to share the gospel of Jesus Christ with them. Now, if we simply focus on the behavior of a group and ask them to change their behavior, that is not going to change who they are or what they believe to be true, what they believe to be real. And so this is why we have a lot of cultural Christianity in our world today, because we've asked people to convert by changing their behavior, so they stop doing those things and they start going to church. But what they value as good or evil, what they believe to be true or false, what they understand to be real, may not have changed. And so until a person is looking at reality from the perspective of God intervening into the natural realm, that God requires a death sentence for every sin, that God provided a sacrifice who would die in the place of sinners, until the person comes to those fundamental realities that Jesus died for sinners, that he was buried and he rose again the 3rd day according to the scriptures, that he fulfilled God's promises, until a person truly surrenders to the lordship of Jesus, that Jesus is King and Lord, that he is real, and that what he says is true, and everything is measured by that, and what he says is good, and everything is measured by that, then the person truly understands what it is to be a follower of Jesus. The foundation of any study in Christian worldview is going to be what God has revealed through the Bible, through his special revelation. Since the inception of our university, Proverbs 9:10 has been a key element in the image of the university. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the knowledge of the Holy One is insight. Without a healthy, reverent fear of God, we cannot hope to know what we need to know about God and the world that He has created. When we have a healthy fear of God, we have a better understanding of who God made us to be and who God made other human beings to be. In Genesis 1:26 we read, "Then God said, Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness." From this verse and the verses that follow, we understand that all human beings are made in the image of God and therefore are image bearers of God. As such, there is a dignity that comes along with that. As such, there is a responsibility that we have to treat others with respect and with dignity because they too bear the image of God. First, we read in Mark 12, verse 30, that Jesus says that the greatest commandment is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. Now keep in mind that heart, soul, and strength were a part of God's initial instruction through Moses in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4 and 5. Here we have Jesus adding with all your mind to it. We are to engage our minds as we share our faith, as we defend our faith, as we understand why we believe what we believe. The Apostle Paul writes an extensive letter to the church at Rome explaining that God is the author of salvation, that every human being is in need of salvation, that Jesus Christ is the means of salvation, and that both Jews and Gentiles can be recipients of God's salvation. At the beginning of this transition from teaching about theology to teaching about the practical application of that theology in everyday life, the Apostle Paul writes these words, "Therefore I urge you, brothers, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God. This is your spiritual act of worship." So according to what God says in His Word, our bodies belong to God, and so what we do with our bodies is a spiritual act of worship. You will note here in this second verse in the chapter that he goes beyond talking about our bodies, and then he begins talking about our minds. Do not be conformed, or do not conform any longer to the pattern of this world, the idea of being squeezed from the outside in. Do not conform any longer to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, His good, pleasing, and perfect will. You are not here on this earth for your will, but for God's will. And the word transform there is the word from which we get metamorphosis, in which a caterpillar turns into a moth or turns into a butterfly. From the inside out, there's a transformation that takes place. How is that done? By renewing our minds. We are transformed as God renews our minds, as we actively involved in renewing our minds. You may be familiar with the term apologetics. It actually comes from a Greek word which means a legal defense on behalf of another. In 1 Peter chapter 3 verse 15, he writes these words, "But in your hearts set apart Christ as Lord. Always be ready to give an answer to anyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have." The Apostle Peter here is saying that we have a reasonable faith, that we can give evidence for. We can lay out the evidence for our faith. In fact, he says that we ought to be prepared to do so. Later on in this chapter, he says we may suffer because we give evidence for our faith. And that's okay. But the point is, we have been called to, first of all, set apart Christ in our hearts as Lord, that He is the Master, He is the ruler of our lives. And because He is ruler, because He is Lord, because He is boss, we need to be ready to answer the questions that people ask about our faith. Now that doesn't mean that you must remain silent until you have all the answers. The whole idea of this course is to help you to learn how to integrate Christian faith with your academics, your Christian faith with your everyday life, so that you'll be able to learn how to Give an answer to everyone who asks you why you believe what you believe.